Coalition of Western States is a group of extremists in the United States of America that has been using deceit since at least the spring of 2014 to sell their dangerous agenda to the American public. Although the coalition was formed in 2014, many of its executives were known to each other for years previously to its formation. Since 2014, as a group, they helped bring unwanted and unnecessary conflict into at least 4 communities: Bunkerville, Nevada, Priest River, Idaho, Harney County, Oregon, and Twin Falls, Idaho. The rhetoric that the Coalition of Western States espoused in these communities was based upon a foundation of deceit. They throw very powerful, solid words in American culture, such as Constitution, liberty, patriot, and freedom, into this deceit to give legitimacy to their propaganda. Before I get into the history of the coalition, I want to give you a taste of this deceit in relation to the word Constitution, so that when you hear it used by the extremists, you will recognize that it is not being used with honorable intent. Even the specific constitutions that they freely distribute are associated with an earlier flim-flam artist, Willard Cleo Skousen. The coalition's most able, quote, Constitution, unquote, propagandist is their so-called legal advisor, Krisanne. In the following excerpt of an episode from Oregon Public Broadcasting's This Land is Our Land, the occupiers they refer to were armed militants led by Ammon Bundy, who took over Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Harney County, Oregon, in January of 2016. Bundy is an associate of the Coalition of Western States in Krisanne. From OPB's This Land is Our Land.
So Conrad, we have another listener question. It's about the Constitution, and I want to bring in OPB reporter Amanda Peacher for this because she spent so much time at the Malheur Refuge listening to the so-called patriots talk about the Constitution. Hi, Amanda.
Hello, Amelia and Conrad.
So let's hear that tape from the listener, and then you and Conrad can tell us a little more.
Hi, OPB. Will you have an investigation or information on the particular constitutional beliefs of the occupiers? It seems much of the event can be traced to an interpretation of the Constitution they carried in their pockets. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. We thought that was a great idea. The pocket constitution that you're thinking of is called the Skousen Constitution. And there's a reason why it's handed out like candy at fairs and parades these days. We'll talk more about the Skousen Constitution in just a little bit.
But first, let's talk about the occupiers' specific interpretation of the Constitution. There are 2 clauses of the Constitution that are important to understand here: the Enclave Clause and the Property Clause.
And here we're going to get a little law schooly, so stick with us.
We promise it's important.
First, let's talk about the Property Clause. For you Constitution buffs, that's Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2.
The Property Clause gives Congress the power to make all needful rules and regulations related to territory or property belonging to the United States. Basically, this is the clause that most people point to when they say the federal government has the right to own and manage lands.
But the occupiers point to another part of the Constitution, the Enclave Clause, to say that the federal government does not have that right.
If you want to follow along in your own pocket constitution, the Enclave Clause is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17.
And it was quoted over and over and over again by the occupiers. Here, for example, is defendant Jason Patrick reading the Enclave Clause to me from his very tattered pocket constitution back in January.
To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by secession of
And it goes on with specifics from there.
Basically, the Enclave Clause is 1787 speak about the District of Columbia. The occupiers quote the clause to argue the federal government can't own land outside of Washington, D.C., unless it's to build, say, a fort, in which case they'd go through state lawmakers to buy land for that fort.
So essentially, what we have is the Property Clause pitted against the occupiers' interpretation of the Enclave Clause. We checked in with Professor Michael Blum from Lewis and Clark Law School about these two clauses, and he said it's pretty clear how they interact.
They both exist in the Constitution, and the Supreme Court has said that the Enclave Clause doesn't limit the Property Clause.
So, in other words, Blum says, the Enclave Clause's mention of those 10 square miles of the District of Columbia doesn't mean that the federal government can't own land beyond that, based on the interpretation of the Property Clause.
And one of the cases that settled this matter, not surprisingly, started in the West. It happened in Utah about 100 years ago.
Well, the case I'm thinking about was a case called Utah Power and Light v. United States. The utility in that case said that they weren't subject to regulation by the Forest Service on forest reserve land because that land had not been purchased with the consent of the state, and the Supreme Court rejected that argument. That's the same argument that the people carrying around the Constitution in their pockets are making.
And Blum says that the Enclave Clause has never been interpreted by the courts in the way that the occupiers read it. But that doesn't change the fact that the occupiers' interpretation is spreading.
The federal government has no authority to own any land outside Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17.
That's Krisanne Hall in a YouTube video from January. She's a former prosecutor from Florida who now travels the country giving talks about the Constitution. You hear the occupiers and others in the Patriot movement referencing her a lot.
And her talks are popular. She's been to Oregon a few times since the occupation, and she always draws a crowd. One of her arguments is that the Property Clause is only meant to refer to territories.
Let's be very clear about this territories thing. Go read the Constitution. Territory is capitalized. This is a proper noun with a specific meaning, and the federal government owns no territory within the continental U.S.
But there's a very clear problem with what Hall's saying. The Constitution is full of capitalizations of nouns that we wouldn't necessarily capitalize today. And there's not necessarily a reason for it.
They were all about the uppercase in the 18th century. Words like election and profit and money are all capitalized in the Constitution. But Hall seems to be successful because she's seen as an authority figure. She has a legal background and is convincing a lot of people.
But to Blum and to most mainstream legal scholars, the legal arguments from the occupiers are just so outside the norm, they don't take them seriously.
But at the same time, there's a pretty strong movement afoot to sort of take back the Constitution that's gaining momentum across the American West. In one sense, it's tied to this larger frustration with the federal government. If you're someone who wants to see federal lands be turned over to local control, then the occupiers' interpretation of the Constitution might resonate.
Right. It's like confirmation bias. People are more willing to believe information that supports their point of view.
But at the end of the day, Blum says these constitutional arguments around the Enclave Clause have no chance of going anywhere in the court system. This debate is done and done.
They've set themselves up as judges because they're not paying any attention to the judges who've looked at this and have, over the centuries, interpreted it. So I guess the one lesson would be, from the occupier's perspective, every individual has final and authoritative interpretations of the Constitution. To me, that's complete chaos. Individuals should interpret the Constitution, but the final word comes from the courts. And the final word has been very consistent concerning the ownership and control of federal lands in this country for a long, long time, longer than anybody has been alive.
So we probably won't see this argument going anywhere in the legal system, but on the political landscape, that's another matter. Some of the same groups pushing this interpretation of the Constitution are also working on state bills to try and get federal lands turned over to states or counties. So this interpretation of the Constitution is definitely connected to the broader federal lands transfer movement.
All right, moving on.
OPB is being generous when they say Krisanne, the coalition's legal advisor, has a legal background. In 2010, she quit her job as a Florida prosecuting attorney. But to this day, she claims she was fired for her Tea Party politics, which of course endears her to her followers. Today, she is not licensed to practice law anywhere in the United States, not even in her home state of Florida. Boasting of being a constitutional attorney, as she does on her homepage, you would think she would at least have a background in constitutional law, which she does not have. As for her drawing crowds, so did the snake oil peddlers, and as we know, the crowds did not make the claims of the peddler any more genuine. Two of the peddlers of Krisanne's snake oil, besides the Coalition of Western States, is the Oath Keepers and the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. Stuart Rhodes, founder of the Oath Keepers, and Richard Mack, founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs, were both involved in the establishment of the Coalition of Western States in 2014. It was in the spring of 2014 the United States government moved to bring an end to a rancher's disregard of federal laws. Cliven Bundy of Bunkerville, Nevada, had for years allowed his cattle to graze on federal land without paying the appropriate grazing fees. Federal agents were given lawful orders to remove the cattle from the federal lands. Bundy and his supporters spread false information, such as the cattle were on his land and that federal agents had posted snipers that were targeting the Bundy family. On April 12, 2014, and even though Cliven Bundy had known the night before that the cattle that had been lawfully impounded would be released, he knowingly sent heavily armed militants to confront the vastly outnumbered law enforcement personnel. I know the Bundy supporters are not going to believe what I just stated are the facts, but what they have been fed is snake oil. Here's the chairman of the Coalition of Western States, Representative Matt Shea of Washington State, about 3 weeks after the retreat of the federal agents at Bunkerville.
Let me ask you about your trip to Nevada, and how did you manage to learn from that, and how did you help the situation by being there?
Well, in Nevada, let me back up. We had a phone conference on a Wednesday night between myself, Sheriff Richard Mack, and Stuart Rhodes of Oath Keepers, and we came to the conclusion, based on the real-time intelligence we were getting from the ground there, that this situation was escalating and likely was going to turn into another Waco or another Ruby Ridge. And so we decided amongst ourselves that it would behoove us to head down there to prevent that from happening, but at the same time take it as an opportunity to educate the American people on what was really going on, and why the Bundys were right to stand against the federal government. And so we went down there to Nevada, and for your listeners, as I'm a constitutional attorney, I'm admitted to practice in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, so I'm not talking out of school here.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen. Get your constitutional elixir here, guaranteed to fix what ails you. Listen to me, I'm a constitutional attorney. Really, Matt Shea? The Washington State Bar Association tells me your area specialty is personal injury. What Shea meant by educating the public is that they would have a soapbox to sell their constitutional snake oil, and in that they did succeed, but they put many innocent lives at risk in doing so. Here's Richard Mack of the Constitutional Sheriffs 2 days after the federal agents retreated.
We were actually strategizing to put all the women up at the front. If they're going to start shooting, it's going to be women that are going to be televised all across the world getting shot by these rogue federal officers.
Rogue federal officers? There was nothing rogue about them. They were officers doing their sworn duty and upholding their oath to the Constitution of the United States of America. The following is Krisanne Hall, the Coalition of Western States legal advisor, and Richard Mack, the Coalition's so-called peace officer coordinator, 6 days after the armed assault on the federal officers.
In there that turned it, but I honestly believe that part of it was because there was women right there.
Yeah.
Right there next to the man.
Well, I heard somebody criticize, I saw some reporter interviewing somebody out there and criticizing the parents for bringing their children out there.
That's none of their business.
Well, not only is it none of their business, but my child would be there. because I want
You take
my
your child everywhere.
Well, I take my child everywhere, but I want my child to see what patriotism looked like.
Boy, they would have felt it.
I want my child to know what it looks like for people with courage and resolve to stand up against tyranny.
I can honestly say I would have loved to have had my whole family there.
Yeah.
I would have loved it.
Paul and Mac are selling the Bunkerville assault on federal officers as a civil rights victory. But I don't recall Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King carrying assault weapons. In two of the situations that the coalition of Western states has agitated with false claims and inflammatory rhetoric, the counties in which they occurred had constitutional sheriffs from Richard Mack's organization. The Priest River, Idaho event had Bonner County Sheriff Darrell Wheeler, and the Twin Falls, Idaho event had Twin Falls County Sheriff Tom Carter. At the Harney County, Oregon event, a so-called constitutional sheriff, Sheriff Glenn Palmer of neighboring Grant County, played a role. In Bunkerville, Clark County, Nevada, the county has a sheriff that respects the rule of law and honors, in letter and in spirit, the Constitution of the United States of America. However, in a podcast 6 days after the retreat of federal officers at Bunkerville, capital T in territory, Krisanne Hall and Richard Mack made Sheriff Douglas Gillespie of Clark County the villain because he respected the laws of the United States of America, which gave the federal agents jurisdiction in that matter.
What we proved here at this whole Bundy thing is that we proved what happens when a sheriff doesn't get involved.
Yes.
And we had this lazy, misdirected, misguided sheriff who said, get this, he says, he wouldn't answer anybody's calls. I know people were all over the country calling him. And so he had his PR, he's hiding behind his PR guy. He takes the calls, but he said that Sheriff Bundy says he doesn't have the authority to interfere. I mean, how many lies does that cover? That he can't interfere. So Sheriff Gillespie, you were saying you don't have the authority to keep your oath of office.
Right.
You don't have the authority to keep your word. You don't have the authority to protect and serve. You don't have the authority to keep the peace. Keep the peace.
You don't have the authority to support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Exactly.
So my question is, Sheriff Gillespie, why are you there?
So
just sucking up oxygen
Bundy,
and taking money from the people.
Yeah, exactly. So he's already announced his retirement, or there would probably be a recall on him.
Yeah.
The following is the coalition's chairman, Matt Shea, 9 days after the assault at Bunkerville, explaining the purpose of the coalition of Western states.
Wow. Now, what was your assessment of the response from Oath Keepers? Was it well organized, and was there a big turnout?
It was a huge turnout by Oath Keepers. There were sheriffs down there. We have since we came together and had a meeting and decided that we should all coordinate throughout all the Western states, and we have formed now the Coalition of Western States that includes leadership from Oath Keepers, leadership from constitutional sheriffs, and elected officials and other patriots throughout the West, because we want to have a coordinated response next time that this happens. This will happen again, whether it's the Bundy Ranch or another place. This will happen again, and we have to be ready for it. So that, I think, was a huge positive, and especially Stuart Rhodes with the Oath Keepers. He and I go back a ways, and he's just done an excellent job, and they did show up down there. And
Representative Shea made it very clear that the coalition of Western states was formed to respond faster with armed militants to prevent federal officers from carrying out their lawful duty in situations similar to the Bundy Ranch in Bunkerville. Cliven Bundy almost certainly had unknown backers at Bunkerville. In bringing the Bundys, Oath Keepers, constitutional sheriffs, and the American Redoubt together at Bunkerville and forming the coalition of Western states, the unknown backers now had an organization that could act publicly to agitate discontent in America without tarnishing their own brand. However, showing up to confront federal law enforcement with a show of force at every opportunity would not give the coalition of Western states the political script that it needed as an ingredient to its constitutional elixir. To this end, the coalition on March 17, 2015, through its Nevada coordinator, Michelle Fiore, introduced Assembly Bill 408 into the Nevada Legislature. This bill effectively laid claim for the state of Nevada to all federal jurisdictions within its borders, whether that be federal lands or law enforcement. A hearing on Bill 408 went before the Nevada Assembly Committee on Natural Resources, Agriculture, and Mining in the state capitol on Tuesday, March 31, 2015. On the day of the meeting, about 100 supporters of the bill held a demonstration, some of whom were brought in on chartered buses and housed at hotels that were said to have been supplied by Cliven Bundy, who spoke at the rally. Amongst those, besides Fiore giving testimony at the hearing, were Matt Shea, chairman of the Coalition of Western States, as well two representatives of Richard Mack's Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association were in attendance. Sam Bushman, Vice President Operations, and also Rick Dalton, Executive Vice President, Legislative Liaison. Lastly, three of Cliven's sons, Ammon, Mel, and Ryan, were witnesses as well. Ammon Bundy worked with Michelle Fiore prior to the committee meeting, preparing testimony for it. The Coalition of Western States would have their political script on legislative record. On pages 10 and 11 of those minutes, Assemblywoman Michelle Fiore states, quote, "I would like Representative Matt Shea from Washington State, who is an attorney, to speak now on the constitutionality of this bill," unquote. Matt Shea, State Representative, 4th Legislative District, Spokane Valley, Washington, and a lawyer specializing in personal injury, states, quote, "I am the co-founder of the Coalition of Western States, an informal group of 30 state legislators from 6 Western states, dedicated to protecting the property rights of citizens in the West. I am also a constitutional attorney by profession, and I have been asked to comment briefly on Assembly Bill 408. I applaud the work you are doing in Nevada to reclaim what was intended to be and is, as a matter of right, Nevada's state land. I want to brief 3 main points today. First, the federal government has failed to live up to its constitutional and historically established obligations. Specifically, Assembly Bill 408 would reaffirm and enforce United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and Clause 17. This very clearly and unequivocally states that Congress has the authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state, in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, stockyards, and other needful buildings. It is very clear that vast swaths of land clearly fall outside the plain language of that provision," unquote. On page 15, it is recorded that Nevada Assemblyman Ira Hansen asked of Shea, quote, "Are you working closely with the American Lands Council?" unquote, to which Shea replied, quote, "Yes, I have met several times with Ken Ivory, and I have also introduced legislation in Washington State to that effect as well," unquote. The Washington legislation Shea speaks of is House Bill 1818-2015, which he co-sponsored with 5 other legislators and introduced in Washington House of Representatives on January 29, 2015. The title of the bill is, quote, "Creating a task force to determine the impacts of adjusting the boundary lines of Washington to create 2 new states, with 1 state east and 1 state west of the Cascade Mountain Range," unquote. Shea's bill is interesting in that the Cascade Mountain Range is also the western border of an area in the western United States known as the American Redoubt, and which Shea is a promoter of. Back to Michelle Fiore's land bill in Nevada. On pages 17 and 18 of the committee's transcript, Ammon Bundy testified, quote, "We can lose 1,000 federal court cases, but the fact remains the same. The land and the resources belong to the people. Furthermore, I reference an even greater authority. For the record, let it be known that I believe in God. I believe that He is the creator of this earth and that He has ultimate power and authority and decides who this earth belongs to." Unquote. Less than a year later, he would forcefully lay siege to a wildlife refuge in Oregon because God told him to. Nevada Assembly Bill 408, as presented to the Nevada Assembly Committee on Natural Resources, Agriculture, and Mining, was deemed unconstitutional by the State of Nevada Legislative Council Bureau. A heavily edited version of Fiore's bill went to a vote in the Nevada Assembly on April 21st, 2015, and was killed by a vote of 34-8. In the summer of 2015, the Coalition of Western States exploited a situation involving a veteran for their own benefit and with a disregard for the veteran's welfare. A Vietnam War veteran of Priest River, Bonner County, Idaho, had a stroke in September of 2014, which led to his name mistakenly added to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System for Firearms, a part of the Brady Act. The Priest River Times reported that the veteran received a letter dated January 30th, 2015, from the Veterans Administration, which read in part, quote, "In our letter of January 20th, 2015, we told you that we were reviewing evidence about your ability to handle your own financial affairs. We finished the review and decided that you are not competent for VA purposes. Therefore, we will find someone to manage them for you." Unquote. The Priest River Times article continues, quote, "Cited within the letter is the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which prohibits anyone deemed incompetent by the VA from, quote unquote, purchasing, possessing, receiving, or transporting a firearm or ammunition. The letter stated Arnold could apply to the VA for relief of the firearms ban imposed by the law and had a year from receiving the letter dated on January 30th, 2015 to appeal the decision." Unquote. The Veterans Administration was trying to help the veteran manage his affairs, and to this end was to meet with the veteran at his home on Thursday, August 6, 2015. The misunderstanding probably could have been resolved at this meeting, and without putting unnecessary stress on the veteran, if the coalition had put the interests of the veteran first. Instead, Representative Heather Scott, the coalition's Idaho coordinator, Richard Mack's so-called constitutional sheriff of Bonner County, Darrell Wheeler, and the coalition's chairman, Matt Shea, wanted to make a show of the coalition making a stand against the so-called tyranny of government. The Priest River Times article quotes Representative Heather Scott as saying at the demonstration, quote, "This is tyranny and unacceptable in my district," quote unquote, she said. "We are here to be proactive and not reactive to nonsense. People will be coming from all over because it's a big deal, and North Idaho will take a stand today. These bureaucrats messed with the wrong county this time, and we will set an example for the nation." Unquote. Washington State Representative Matt Shea would add the exploitation of this veteran to the Coalition of Western States constitutional elixir. In October of 2015, another situation was developing that would give the Coalition of Western States another soapbox to peddle their constitutional elixir and to use deceit once again to sell it. Two ranchers in Burns, Oregon, Dwight Hammond Jr. and his son Stephen Hammond, who were convicted of arson on federal lands, were to be resentenced to more time in prison on October 7th, 2015. At the original trial in 2012, the judge had erred in giving them lenient sentences for their crimes. As federal lands were involved, the coalition of western states had an opportunity to again confront the so-called tyranny of the federal government. A few days previously, on October 3rd and 4th, Matt Shea and Chuck Baldwin were speakers at the 19th Annual Old Paths Christian History Conference in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Baldwin had been on stage with other coalition members at Cliven Bundy's press conference of April 14, 2014. The following are two excerpts of a session titled The American Redoubt that Baldwin gave at the Coeur d'Alene conference.
But I'm not discouraged. God is on the throne. He's a sovereign God. He's not worried. He's not biting his fingernails at what's going to happen next. He's not caught off guard. God knows what he's going to do, and he knows how he's going to use each of us. Suffice it to say, we each need to be certain that we're where God wants us to be, that we're doing what he wants us to do, that our hearts are right with him. Let him use us as he chooses, and by faith march forward, knowing that with Christ, all things are possible. We can do all things. Let's just see what God has in mind for that redoubt. Let's just see. Let's see. And God in his word has given us the principles, and that's another part of the problem, is our pastors are not teaching their people how to recognize good government. They don't even know how to recognize it. They don't know what the issues are. They don't understand natural law and the principles of natural law as found in the Bible and how that relates to good government. They don't understand it. How does it relate to liberty? For example, you talk to the average Christian patriot in the average church. They say, well, where do you get the right to keep and bear arms? And 9 out of 10 will say what? Second Amendment. Nah. Nope. Second Amendment doesn't give us anything. Our duty to keep and bear arms is not given us by the Second Amendment or the government that wrote it. It's given us by our Creator God. The purpose of the Second Amendment is to protect the duty and the right that we have naturally under God. If you think that government gave you the right to keep and bear arms, then government can take that right away from you. But if you know that God gave you the duty of self-defense as a natural right, then you won't allow government to take it from you, because that's not government's venue. It's not government's jurisdiction. We had the right of self-defense a long time before the Second Amendment was ever written. Same thing with the freedom of religion and the freedom of conscience, and freedom of speech, and all these things that are codified in the Bill of Rights. Those are, I mean, Brother John's done a great job of this, and other Brother Steve, you've done a great job of this, and some of the great election sermons that you host and so forth, and you show the biblical qualification and the biblical example of, you can take every right, so-called right, in the Bill of Rights, and every one of them has a biblical foundation. Every one of them has a natural law foundation. Every one of them. So, somebody comes along and says, well, I want to protect the Second Amendment. Well, it's not the Second Amendment. It's the God-given natural right.
Amen. That's good.
Of which the Second Amendment is supposed to protect. And if you don't understand the foundation and the natural law principle of the Second Amendment, then all you're left with is whatever government gives you. And if government can give it to you, then government can take it away. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been making a field day here lately out of my statement that when the day that my guns are outlawed, that I'll be an outlaw. And the SPLC has written here just last week. It just wrote a big thing about that. Chuck Baldwin is willing to be an outlaw over the gun issue. Amen. Guilty. Guilty. I don't try to deny it. I meant every word of it. You take my guns, if you outlaw my guns, I'm an outlaw. Because you, Mr. Legislator, Mr. Governor, Mr. Congressman, Mr. President, have no lawful jurisdiction to interfere with my God-given duty of self-defense. That's why. Our pastors aren't teaching that. The pastors aren't teaching that. And so the people in the pews are ignorant. They just don't understand it. Matt Shea just walked in. Talk about a great legislator. There he is. Let me tell you what. If we had a Congress full, a State House full, a Washington, D.C. full of legislators like Matt Shea, we wouldn't be having any of these problems that we're talking about today. We just wouldn't be having them.
Chuck Baldwin's rhetoric gives people such as the militant snipers at Bunkerville, who had law enforcement officers in their sights, a false sense of empowerment. The following is an excerpt of Matt Shea's pitch at the conference.
When we have a pastor in Bremerton, a football coach in Bremerton who wants to just pray on a 50-yard line after a game, voluntarily, and the school district takes all their resources and begins investigating that football coach, we've got a problem. I mean, what about all the gang problems and drug use in the school? I mean, couldn't there be a better use of investigative resources? Then we have Barronelle Stutzman down in Tri-Cities right now who refused to perform or be part of a homosexual marriage ceremony, and the state, not the individuals that came to her, but the state sued. Folks, Christian persecution is here. Tyranny is here. Lawlessness is here. And it's going to be up to all of us to stand on that line and defend freedom and liberty wherever that happens. And I'm going to tell you something. When we stand peaceably and we pray to the Lord for victory, and we stand peaceably but armed, and how many of you are carrying today? Raise your hand.
Oh, good.
Okay, if you are not, consider that a challenge, and here's why. We need to live the Constitution every single day. Live it. All right? And practice those things which we preach. And especially when we have a God-given unalienable right to keep and bear arms, we better be keeping and bearing arms. You know, Pastor Weaver gives a great sermon on this. At the Founding Fathers, their churches, the men sat on the outside of the pew, not just because, but because the rifles were lined up down the center of the church so they could protect. Yeah. So what happened up at Priest River, Idaho, where the Veterans Administration threatened the firearms rights? This happened right here in North Idaho, where the Veterans Administration threatened the firearms rights of somebody locally. And within 6 hours, 100 patriots showed up, and Sheriff Darrell Wheeler, a constitutional sheriff, showed up and said, no bureaucrat is going to take away someone's God-given unalienable right. If it's going to ever be taken away, it'll be done in a court of law by a jury of their peers. Wow, praise God for that. And you know what happened when we stood on the line? We stood in that guy's front yard, the VA shows up, and you should have seen the look on that guy's eyes when 100 people were staring back at him. And we had crosses and appeal to heaven flags and all of that stuff. What did the government do? They backed down. Every single time they backed down. That's why we should be emboldened to continue to stand with courage. Courage is...
Quote, when we stand peaceably but armed, unquote. I guess he does not understand that weapons are not peaceful. As for the Founding Fathers taking their guns to church, I would not take Shea's word for this, as in February of 2016, he entered a gun rights bill into the Washington State House of Representatives with Founding Fathers quotes that were fake. The American Redoubt covers the territory of the states of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and also the eastern sections of Oregon and Washington states at the Cascade Mountains. Beginning with the September 2nd, 2015 podcast, a month before the Old Paths Conference, Shea had been mentioning the American Redoubt in his podcast opening remarks, and continued to do this until January 2016, when the Oregon Standoff leaders were arrested or killed. This is his opening words to his podcast just after the conference.
Good afternoon, fellow patriots. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to Patriot Radio, broadcasting live from the capital of free Washington, Spokane Valley, deep in the heart of God's country, in the American Redoubt, in the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news. And this is the year, once again, we take our freedom back and wake up, and wake our friends and neighbors up as well, because our hope is not in man, but in Jesus Christ. And we can't end in prayer. We must also move to action. And as James 4:17 admonishes us, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. And we should have that tattooed on John Boehner's forehead, I think. And now from the...
At a firearms expo in Lakeside, Arizona, on the weekend of October 16th, 17th, and 18th of 2015, the Coalition of Western States would have the opportunity to strategize their response to the Hammonds case in Burns, Oregon. One of the three sponsors of the, quote, Constitutional Arms Expo and Rally, unquote, was the Southwest Shooting Authority, which is owned by Cope Reynolds, the Southwest Grassroots Coordinator for the Coalition of Western States and a member of the Arizona chapter of the Liberty for All 3%, a so-called Patriots group. The speakers slated to appear alongside Reynolds on Saturday the 17th were Washington State Representative Matt Shea, Washington State Representative Graham Hunt, Idaho Representative Heather Scott, Richard Mack, and also Anthony Bosworth of the Washington State chapter of the Liberty for All 3% militant group. All are executive members of the Coalition of Western States. Also joining them was a resident of Arizona, Lavoy Finicum, a militant who had been at the Bundy Ranch in 2014. As Arizona is the home state of the coalition's vice chairman, Lyle Rapaski, it would not surprise me if he was there as well. As the Coalition of Western States exploited the situation with the veteran in Priest River, Idaho, they would attempt to do the same in Burns, Oregon, by exploiting the Hammonds' return to prison for their own agenda. However, they faced two major obstacles in doing so. The first was that in Idaho, their so-called tyrannical opponent, the Veterans Administration, could not defend their actions because their relationship with the veteran was confidential. The coalition could control the narrative, which they would not be able to do in Burns. Secondly, in Priest River, one of Richard Mack's so-called constitutional sheriffs, Sheriff Darrell Wheeler, by being the county sheriff, gave the coalition an air of credibility, whereas in Burns, the county sheriff is David Ward, who is not a, quote, constitutional sheriff, unquote, but a man who respects both the rule of law and his oath to the Constitution of the United States. Mack did, however, have a sheriff, Sheriff Glenn Palmer of Grant County, which is adjacent to Sheriff David Ward's Harney County. In 2012, Palmer was Mack's Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association's, quote, Lawman of the Year, unquote. The Hammonds were scheduled to return to prison January 4th, 2016, giving the coalition lots of time to plan their strategy. Sheriff Palmer recruited more of his, quote, special deputies, unquote, bringing their number to 65. They reported only to him. The coalition produced propaganda videos starring Ammon Bundy that gave a false narrative to the Hammonds' crimes and vilified the United States Bureau of Land Management. The Coalition of Western States, through Richard Mack, Ammon Bundy, and other militants, harassed Harney County Sheriff David Ward to become a supporter of their agenda. It didn't work, and Sheriff Ward remained true to his oath throughout the conflict. The memorial building at the Harney County Fairgrounds was rented for Tuesday, December 15th, so Ammon and the other militants of Burns could sell their snake oil in what was billed as a community meeting regarding the Hammonds.
My dad, the whole time, well, not the whole time, he began, him and a couple of the other ranchers and ranchers, they began to study what was their position, how could they fight this, and after an exhaustive amount of research and study and so forth, they found something that was even greater than what they ever imagined, and that was found in the Constitution of the United States, and the reason why we passed it out, because they found that the federal government didn't have authority to be administrating the lands in the first place. That under Article 1, 8, 17, it says that in order for the federal government to own and control land inside a state, they first have to get consent from the state legislature. Second, they have to purchase it. And third, they can only use it for the erection of forts, magazines, dockyards, arsenals, and other needful buildings. Those are the rules that the federal government must follow in order to own and control land inside a state. So ask yourself, is the land that is being controlled in your county, have they got consent from the state legislatures to control it? Did they purchase it? And are they using it for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings? I'm not seeing any heads. Are they? Did they purchase it? Did they get consent from the state legislatures? See, and that's what...
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and get your constitutional elixir here. Guaranteed to fix what ails you. Listen to me, because I know God's will. As any great artist knows, emotion helps to sell the performance, and Ammon is good at calling up emotions to sell the coalition's constitutional elixir. Cliven Bundy did extensive research? Doubt it. During an interview after the episode at Bunkerville in April of 2014, Cliven had said, quote, "I want to tell you one more thing I know about the Negro," unquote. Then Cliven states how he sees African Americans today in Nevada and concludes with, quote, "And I've often wondered, are they better off as slaves, picking cotton and having a family life and doing things? Or are they better off under government subsidy? They didn't get no more freedom, they got less freedom," unquote. The militants organized a so-called Committee of Safety, which included members from Harney County, and which would become an ingredient in the elixir the coalition of western states was brewing in Harney County.
What do we do? Right? And we have across the United States a people that will stand with you. I've already explained that, and I'm confident in that. Okay? But the thing is it's not necessarily right for us or for the people to come in here and to make a stand without the people forming and being in control of it. That's what this Committee of Safety is where the people elect this committee, and this committee is in charge of those that will come in and assist across this country in defending the rights of this people and in enforcing the Constitution. And I'm not going to dance around what we're talking about here. We're talking about removing these unconstitutional agencies from Harney County and freeing the people back up to go ranching, logging, or whatever else. But the people have to, you have to exhibit enough organization to form these committees of safety so that you can charge and be in charge of the militia. That's what it comes down to. That is the proper way in which this is supposed to happen. And Ryan has explained this.
It is important to point out here that although a committee of safety was formed, they had no legal powers in the county. They were not elected officials, and the documents they issued in the coming weeks carried no legal weight. I don't think it would have mattered whether or not a Harney County Committee of Safety was formed. The militants would have continued down a path to confrontation with the so-called tyrannical federal government regardless. However, having Harney County residents on one gave the militants a foot in the door that they would not have had otherwise. Ammon said the militants were going to be, quote, enforcing the Constitution, unquote, and, quote, removing these unconstitutional agencies from Harney County, unquote. Earlier in the meeting, he said how they were going to do that.
It's very simple. Restore those things back to Harney County by removing the federal government and going to work. Well, depends on if you're committed enough. And Ryan, are you ready? Because Ryan here, I want to, I guess, he represents and many thousand people across the United States. And I want to read something to you in the Second Amendment. I want to read the whole Second Amendment to you. Can you go there? It's on page 21. You just asked the question, how do we do it? Right? Second Amendment. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Can I read it again? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Can I read it again? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's how. And that's why I'm alive. Because if the militia did not come to our defense, I would not be here today. My family would have been murdered. They told us that they were going to murder us. And until the militia came and put a check and balance on them, they were going to murder us. And as soon as the militia came, all of a sudden, now they shaped up and left the area. And this can be done without bloodshed. We do not have to believe that just because we pull the militia in, that all of a sudden we have to have a gunfight. That's not what we're proposing here. We're proposing that the people go about their business according to the Constitution, and the militia protects them while they do that. That's what we're proposing here.
In a show of support for the Hammonds, a public protest was planned to take place in Burns, Harney County on Saturday, January 2nd, 2016, 2 days before the Hammonds would go back to prison. A select few members of the Coalition of Western States, which includes Cliven and M. Bundy, and their backers, were also planning for the protest to be a means to kickstart their larger goal of bringing conflict into a community to further their agenda of making the federal government illegitimate. The following is an excerpt of militant shock jock Pete Santilli interviewing Richard Mack in Burns on January 2nd, the day of the protest.
Sheriff Mack, also, I think you're aware of how many steps have been taken to exhaust every peaceful legal means to redress grievance, to get the attention of everyone up and down the chain of command. I've spoken to, yes, I did speak to Frank Papagni himself, the U.S. Attorney. He believes that he's totally justified. Are you concerned about the lack of response by the federal government, by the local sheriff, by the county? Are you concerned about that they've just ignored it all?
The brainwashing that they've gone through. I mean, King George III thought he was justified too in what he did in 1776 to Americans. Of course, he started it back earlier than that, and of course, it prompted the Boston Tea Party.
Yes, sir.
And we're going to have a lot more Boston Tea parties.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, we are. But the Hammonds have asked that this remain peaceful, and we're here to respect their wishes.
Yes, sir.
And you and I both agree that we hope that this remains peaceful in America.
Yes, sir.
But it's not going to.
And that would be by their choice, though.
Exactly.
By their choice. If anything goes from peaceful to non-peaceful.
Sooner or later, this isn't going to stay peaceful. Sooner or later, people are not going to put up with this.
And you know what? That will certainly prove our point about what we've been screaming about, what you've been screaming about for many, many years, is what their intentions are. Is that if those that oppose us ultimately want to kill us, as well.
Pete Santilli said to Mac, quote, "I think you are aware of how many steps have been taken to exhaust every peaceful legal means to redress grievance," unquote. Important note here. What Pete Santilli means by exhausting every peaceful legal means was their formation of the Committee of Safety and all the whimsical documents that they and the militants produced and presented to the elected officials of Harney County. Remember, capital T in territory, Krisanne Hall, is the Coalition of Western States legal advisor. Quoting from the clip, Mac states, quote, "You and I both agree that we hope this remains peaceful and American, but it is not going to," unquote. Mac knows that marching down the street and waving placards is not going to get the confrontation with the so-called tyrants that the Coalition of Western States is looking for. And as we know from the Bundy Ranch, they are not above putting people at risk to do so. The following is Ammon Bundy after the protest calling for the takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge.
For those that understand that they came to make a hard stand, those that know what's going on here and have seen it for many, 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 many years, those who are ready to actually do something about it, I'm asking you to follow me and go to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. And we're going to make a hard stand. Now, there are already agents on the roads that have blocked the road. And they do not want us to go out there. And we're going to go out there anyway. And we're going to make a hard stand. We're going to be peaceful about it. And that's what we're going to do. So anybody...
Can they legally keep us from going out there?
No, they can't legally keep you from going out there, but when does that stop?
Is it passable with the passenger car?
Yes.
All right.
And there's already people out there already.
Ammon and company were looking for a confrontation, but the so-called tyrants did not give them one. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and other law enforcement stayed away, something the Coalition of Western States did not expect. On Monday, January 4th, Dwight and Stephen Hammond voluntarily returned to prison, but not before distancing themselves from the militants who had laid siege to their county. Also on the 4th, the militants at the Malheur Refuge held a press conference to issue their demands, and also in which Ammon made this statement.
How many of Obama administration looking into gun control, do you think?
Okay, one more question.
Some of our listeners say that if this had happened in a federal building in downtown Denver, the feds would have gone in guns blazing 24 hours ago. Why are you different?
One is we're based on constitutional principles. We know that we're right, and we chose a facility that was not downtown. Thank you.
How many are you, sir?
Ammon's, quote, constitutional principles, unquote, comes straight out of a bottle of genuine, guaranteed to turn the whimsical into holy text constitutional elixir. In the fall of 2015, when the coalition decided to exploit the situation with the Hammonds in Harney County, Oregon, they needed territory so that the militia's foot soldiers that they would be summoning to Burns could defend it. At Bunkerville in 2014, They falsely sold the militia on the idea that Cliven Bundy had rights to the land his cattle were on. At Priest River, the coalition falsely sold the veteran on the idea they were there to defend him and his home. In Harney County, Oregon, which is rural America and within the bounds of the American Redoubt, they would falsely sell the militia's foot soldiers the idea that they were at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge to defend the Constitution. By having the press conference, the militants hoped to provoke law enforcement, but it was a big mistake, as they lost all control of the narrative. The next day, the militants posted a call to arms video on YouTube.
Cooper, we're out here at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge Center here in Oregon. What's the location? Is this Burns still?
Burns, Oregon. Well, south of Burns.
I'm here with John Ritzheimer, Ammon Bundy, Lavoy Finicum. Patriots ready to make a stand. This is a call to arms. Ammon?
We need you to come to Burns, or to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, which is about 30 miles from Burns, Oregon. We have taken over the refuge. We have made a hard stand. We have done this because this refuge has been a tool that has been used to destroy ranchers, destroy loggers, and to oppress the people here in Harney County. We feel like this refuge will provide a place for patriots from all over the country to come and to be able to have a place out of the snow. We have food, and we have a place for you to stay. And we plan on being here for a long time. And when the snow melts here, our intentions are to free to allow the ranchers. We're going to protect the ranchers while they begin to ranch, protect the loggers so they can start logging again, so that they can start mining again, and that is our plan. But we need bodies. We need you to come. We need those of you who understand what is happening in this country to come and to stand.
You guys, this is Blaine Cooper. You say you stand for the Constitution and you're ready to make a change in this country. You're sick of what's going on in our country. We need men. It's time to make that stand. We all chosen to make that stand. It takes you too. We can't do it alone. Please get out here. Lavoy?
I'm doing this for my kids. I have 20 grandkids and daughters and sons. I want them to be free. I want our Constitution to be upheld in its original intent. I want freedom to be restored to our country. And unfortunately, our political class does not have the will. They're entrenched and they won't do it. And so here in this little place, we'll uphold the Constitution. We'll return these resources to the people. It belongs to the people of Harney County, these good folks. And so I'll stand here with my friends. We plan on hurting no one. We're only restoring freedom, liberties, so that these good people can use their lands and resources again. And that is why we're here. There's already people here from all walks of life. I don't know the first thing about ranching. I'm a city boy myself. 11 years in the Marine Corps. Now I'm serving my country. This is serving your country. Those of you that claim to protect and defend the Constitution, this is what it looks like. And we need more people to get out here and protect and defend the Constitution.
After the news conference of the 4th, any hope for the militants to recruit the same numbers of militia that had shown up to the Bundy Ranch in 2014 were dashed, as news agencies exposed the militants' rhetoric as fallacious and not worthy of serious consideration. With law enforcement taking a non-confrontational approach to the militants, there is no opportunity for the militants to respond and so fight the so-called tyranny of government and perhaps regain the narrative. With no tyrannical narrative, such as they had invented at the Bundy Ranch, the coalition's Stuart Rhodes could not rally his Oath Keepers to Oregon for fear of a mutiny within. Hundreds of Harney County residents showed up at Burns on Wednesday, January 6, 2016, for a community meeting to discuss how they felt about the militants' Malheur assault. Some of them were sympathetic, but almost all showed by a raise of hands that they wanted the militants to leave their county. The militants at the refuge had named themselves, quote, Citizens for Constitutional Freedom, unquote. However, the community meeting showed that they were no, quote, citizens, unquote, of Harney County, but were outsiders interfering in the affairs of Harney County and bringing conflict to it. Also on Wednesday, the Western States Sheriff's Association, an organization that represents over 800 sheriffs from 15 Western states, released a statement in support of Harney County Sheriff David Ward and other law enforcement agencies responding to the unlawful actions of the militants. The statement effectively removed any possibility of Richard Mack imposing his organization into the conflict. As well on the 6th, Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers, in an open letter to M. Bundy, informed him that his organization could not support his actions concerning the wildlife refuge. The coalition of Western states' effort to have an armed show of force against the United States government was over. But the armed conflict that they had brought to Harney County was not, and would not end for another 37 days. On January 9th, 1 week after the armed takeover started, leadership from the Coalition of Western States were among a group of individuals that arrived unannounced in Burns to try and get Sheriff Ward to support the militants at the refuge. The group was unable to meet with Sheriff Ward, but did succeed in having a meeting with a number of local officials and law enforcement who were part of the response to the takeover. Although the leadership of the coalition participated in the meeting, the members did not make their relationship known to the meeting, and the chair of the meeting, Harney County Judge Steve Grasty, was unaware of it. A sound recording of this meeting found its way to Oregon Public Broadcasting, OPB, and reporter John Sepulveda. On March 16, 2016, Mr. Sepulveda published a story titled, GOP Politicians Planned and Participated in Key Aspects of Refuge Occupation. The recording was released shortly thereafter. The following are the introductions at the first of the meeting.
So let's take a minute and do introductions. So, I'm Steve Grasty and I'm Harney County Judge. If you're not familiar with Oregon, in Harney County we got a judge and 2 commissioners. I'm full-time, the commissioners are part-time.
I'm Jason Myers, Marion County Sheriff.
Tim Callahan, Harney County District Attorney.
Eric Barnard, FBI.
And you are?
Lieutenant Brian Needham, Harney County Sheriff's Office. I'm second in command of the Sheriff's Office.
Thank you. I'm State Representative Graham Hunt from Washington State.
Thank you very much.
State Representative Matt Shea, Washington State.
Okay.
I'm a representative from Idaho, Judy Boyle.
Judy
Boyle,
thank you.
I'm Idaho State Rep. Heather Scott, District 1.
Idaho Representative Sage Dixon, SAGEDIXON.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
I'm Dallas Hurd, Oregon representative from Roseburg.
So, and this is my wife Cindy, and when you ask about local perspective, I just said, hey, jump in the car. She and I have been apart from each other way more than we're used to and over the last few weeks.
You got a little something going on down here?
A little bit. So let me give you a quick overview, and then we'll ask some others here to talk, and then let's talk, answer your questions, and see what we can do to help you.
Sir, before we start, we have a representative, Michelle Fiore from Nevada, that was unable to come up here. We'd like to put it on speaker or something so she can listen in as well. That would be.
Hello.
Hello. Good morning, Representative. This is Steve Grasty, Harney County Judge.
Hi, Mr. Grasty, did you say?
It is Grasty, and it's spelled like nasty. Grasty. And don't tell my mother I said that.
I love it.
All right.
Okay, so Grasty.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's what we'll do to save a little bit of time. We'll do some introductions of those folks that are local. I think you probably know the legislators that are here. So, again, Steve Grasty.
Meeting attendee and the Coalition of Western States Washington State Coordinator Graham Hunt resigned his seat in the Washington Legislature on February 2, 2016, after it was found that he had been embellishing his military service record in his bio. The following is Judge Steve Grasty's opening remarks and his plea for the visiting politicians to not visit the militants at the Wildlife Refuge. Remember, the members of the Coalition of Western States in that meeting showed that they had no honor by not telling Judge Grasty of their relationships to each other and to M. Bundy. They were lying.
Let me talk a little bit about some of the things that happened. I want to do the community perspective from mine. Law enforcement, we'll let them talk with everybody understanding that law enforcement's not going to be able to talk about their tactical decisions and strategies. So a few nights ago, after I just don't have any other way to describe this. We had an armed group invade our community, came in here under the pretext of trying to help a couple, changed in the middle of the protest parade, and it was well known that it was a strategy. You could tell that from the Peter Santilli show, who said we're going to go take over the Refuge headquarters midway through the march. So it was well planned. They left. They fragmented away from several other groups that were astounded that they were going to do that, and with arms took over a facility in my community. And I'm going to tell you, I'm openly angry. I'm going to stay openly angry at Mr. Bundy and his friends. This isn't the way we do business here. But so a couple nights ago, we had a community meeting. I would argue that there's little chance that any of you have ever had a public meeting in your community where 10% of the entire population was there. That occurred here. If you got a small enough one, you can do it. But it was astounding to see the turnout. If you took the voices that are not part of this community out of the room, I would guess the split was about 80 or 90-10 on go home, Mr. Bundy, go back to your families. If you added them in, it was about 80-20 to go home. It was 100% we're sick of government regulations. I'm there. I get that. I'm pretty passionate about the 17 years that I've spent in hundreds of trips across the state and dozens across the nation saying we need to be heard and locals need to be empowered. That's not what this is about. We have a group of criminals that have taken over a facility in our community that this community happens to love and take ownership, and this guy thinks he knows what's best for us. Forgive me, because I'm pretty passionate about this after a week. You may be perceived as no different. You're coming into our community and you're going to fix us. And every one of you can know that when that happens in your community is upset by that. I'm really curious, Representative, you said that you had something, legislative leadership buy into this?
My leader, Mike McLean, used to be Bruce Hanna, was the Republican leader for the House of Representatives. Mike McLean is now my caucus leader, and he's aware that I've been coming over here and supports what I'm doing.
Wow. So I can tell you we've been talking to Congressman Walden a number of times, and he understands the need to stay back and allow this situation to be handled. There are crimes going on out there, and we're very worried about it. Everybody, I've never heard one person say different than this. There is no intention on any law enforcement agency to go out there with guns ablazing and take over. That's not going to happen. Clearly, I mean, I'm speaking for where I shouldn't be, but I can tell you I've been in too many meetings. I'm going to tell you that.
Judge, could you just repeat that for me, because that's actually very relieving. So is it, to my understanding, that the FBI and local law enforcement are not going to go to the refuge, guns ablazing, kind of like a Ruby Ridge?
So let me finish up. That is accurate, the statement you just made. We'll let law enforcement talk a little bit more about that better than I can, but we'll come back to that. But your statement is correct, and it's what's been said all along, and what I believe we'll hold to. I am worried that your message is going to be perceived as your visit out there if you go, and I hope you don't go. But I'm worried
that your visit is going to be perceived as all I got to do is do an armed insurrection at a federal facility and I can get the bully pulpit and state and federally elected officials will show up at my doorstep. And it will be a terrible message. I want to end with two more things and then we'll try and answer this. Any questions that we can for you. I don't want you to go, but I'm going to tell you what you risk. I'm an elected official. I've ran 7 times and been beat twice. We all have some love of the jobs that we do and those careers that are associated with being politicians. But also knowing most of us, that's not what drives us in day-to-day life is getting reelected. You risk taking ownership of anything that goes south. If something goes south when this is over, and somebody asks me what happens, I'm going to tell this whole story, including a whole bunch of elected officials from our state and others went out there, didn't resolve the problem, and it blew up. That will be part of the story. You risk that. Make your own decision on that. I'm not telling you that you're wrong, but my advice is do not go and meet with Mr. Bundy. I've met with Mr. Bundy once in this office. Your impression that he's a nice guy, he is not a nice guy. He is a very bad man. My wife is scared to be alone. She closes the blinds before I get home. She has a gun sitting beside her chair at home. We went out 2 weekends ago and refreshed her skills with a pistol. At least the world now knows she's armed and dangerous. I will tell you she's always been dangerous, but she's now armed. But this isn't funny. I pack everywhere I go with me except inside this building. I've never done that before, ever. But when people walk into this building with firearms, you got to be kidding me. So I don't know if I'm changing your mind, but I really want to change your mind. You cannot come into my community and fix us. It will not work. So.
The Coalition of Western States leadership did go to the wildlife refuge, and they did meet with the militants. But it was not to see how to bring the conflict to an end. It was an offensive by them to try to take back the narrative and undermine law enforcement. As a result of their visit, the armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was unnecessarily prolonged. And they are the ones that own the conflict going south with the death of militant Robert Lavoie Finicum on January 26, 2016. Here's another clip from the Coalition's meeting of the 9th in Burns with Judge Grasty.
I have a question, if it's okay. This is Michelle Fiore. And I totally understand what you're saying, and I feel for you in your position for your community. But one thing that I'm looking at as a bigger picture is our western states, where the BLM has become a bureaucratic agency of basically terrorism, and they have taken lands from your citizens, and they have put all of our citizens at risk. So how do we answer that? I mean, right now the spotlight is on Oregon, and Rep. Matt Shea and myself dealt with it when it was here in Nevada, and thank God we winded up with a peaceful solution because we had reps from all across the western states helping us here in my state, which is the state of Nevada. So at what point do you guys say, look, we do have a big federal problem. BLM has taken advantage not just of your citizens, but our citizens and Idaho citizens and Texas citizens. So at what point do we band together as elected officials and say enough is enough to the BLM? So can we divert this conversation? At what point are we actually going to do something for our citizens?
So, ma'am, I've worked 17 years very passionately on that issue. And I guess the only good thing here is there's only one state legislature of mine in this room, so I get no payback in the middle of it, at the end of this. I'm going to tell you, we have passionately done that. There are more acres of private ground by tens of thousands today in my county than there was 20 years ago. Not more public, more private land because of swaps. We have this success story. We've gained this relationship, and it's different in every place. Do we talk about transfer of federal ownership to us sometimes, but run the numbers. Who's done that? Who's done it successfully? No state, no county has done that successfully. We don't have the resources to put millions of dollars to run this up through the Supreme Court. That's not the conversation today. Get these criminals, and they are terrorists, out of my county.
By not sealing off the refuge, law enforcement gave the coalition members an opportunity to peddle their elixir. As an example, Ammon announced that he was going to have the wire fence cut between the refuge and a neighboring ranch so the ranchers' cattle could graze on the refuge range. On Monday, January 11th, a big show was made of the militants cutting and removing a section of the fence between the properties. Unfortunately for the coalition, the rancher did not want the wire fence cut, and an annoyed rancher mended his fence the next day. The Coalition of Western States' so-called legal advisor, Krisanne Hall, traveled to Oregon the third week of January to give 2 pitches for their constitutional elixir, the first pitch being on Monday the 18th. It was no coincidence that she was there during the same week as another county community meeting was to be held. This one meant to be an opportunity for the people of Harney County to come together and end the discord in their community. On Tuesday, the 19th, and despite the fact that at the last community meeting it was shown overwhelmingly that Harney County wanted the Bundys to leave, the coalition's provocateurs, Ammon and Company, showed up at this meeting, and for a maximum effect, after it had already started. They used the meeting once again to incite conflict amongst the citizens of Harney County. The next day, Krisanne Hall gave her second pitch for their constitutional elixir, which sells best in times of conflict. Also on Wednesday, the 20th, militant propagandist Pete Santilli interviewed Anthony Bosworth at the Militia Refuge. Bosworth is the coalition's Northwest grassroots coordinator and is also a member of the Washington State chapter of the Liberty for All 3% armed militant group.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm with Anthony Bosworth. You're going to get to know him a little bit better. I wanted to spend a few minutes with him. He's been here on the ground helping Krisanne Hall. That was a tremendous event, a 2-day session, her teaching the U.S. Constitution here. But Anthony Bosworth, it's been an honor to meet you. I've heard. That's right. And your connection to Krisanne Hall came through the Liberty Movement. You've been in contact with her for a while. I'm interested to hear about that.
Exactly, yeah.
I was pleased to see that you're connected to her. I didn't know until you arrived with her.
Well, it started out early on when she first started doing what she's doing and everything. I seen a little tiny video that and it was probably one of her very first, that she placed on YouTube. And I listened to it, and I was astounded. I was shocked to find out that somebody else interpreted it the same way I did. And so I got in contact with her and her assistant, and we started talking, and through talking and everything, I decided that it would be great to bring her to the state of Washington.
As the arrival of Krisanne Hall with Bosworth shows, the coalition was coordinating their effort to make the armed takeover political rather than the criminal action it was, and they had been encouraged early on to do so by the commentary of the Republican leadership in Washington, D.C. On Tuesday, January 5th, 3 days after the takeover, Representative Greg Walden of Oregon made a 20-minute speech in the United States Senate, and although he said he could not support the militant takeover, he did understand their position. But that was enough to give the militants some political cover. A week after Hall's visit, the turning point of the conflict would occur. On Tuesday, January 26, the militant leadership, with a few others, left Malheur to attend a public meeting in John Day, Grant County, home of so-called constitutional sheriff Glenn Palmer. As all of the leadership were making the trip, it is possible that they were making plans to abandon Harney County for Grant County, where they would have the support of Sheriff Palmer and his, quote, special deputies, unquote. The group would be traveling Highway 395 in 2 vehicles. In the first were leaders Lavoy Finicum, the driver, Ryan Bundy, Ryan Payne, and Shauna Cox. Traveling with them as well was Victoria Sharp, a member of a family group that was going to perform at the meeting in John Day. In the second vehicle was leader Ammon Bundy with Brian Cavalier and Mark McConnell, who happened to be a government informant. While still in Harney County, they were intercepted and stopped by Oregon State Police and the FBI at about 6:26 p.m. local time. Ammon Bundy and Brian Cavalier were arrested without incident. However, Lavoy Finicum would not obey the orders of the police and at one point yelled, quote, "Well, I'm going to see the sheriff in Grant County," unquote. About 3.5 minutes later, he attempted to flee the traffic stop, but down the road a ways found his way blocked by a police barricade. He tried to go around the blockade by taking the truck off the road, but became stuck in the deep snow. He exited his vehicle, confronting the police officers, and while reaching for his gun, was shot and killed by the state police. Ryan Bundy, Ryan Payne, and Shauna Cox were arrested. Lavoy Finicum may have decided differently about his decision to flee the traffic stop and later confront the officers if he had known that the FBI knew about his relationship with William Keebler of Utah. As early as May of 2015, the FBI had undercover agents amongst William Keebler's militant group, which was planning to, quote, "go on the offensive," unquote. On June 22, 2016, the FBI arrested Keebler for attempting to detonate a pipe bomb the day before at a remote Bureau of Land Management facility in rural Arizona. With the key leadership arrested or dead, the FBI set up roadblocks just outside Malyer's headquarters, securing the area and access to and from it. There were still a number of armed occupiers at the headquarters, but most left when the FBI informed them they were free to go as long as they obeyed law enforcement orders when they approached the checkpoints. By Thursday, the 28th, there were just 4 armed militants remaining at the headquarters, where they remained for another 14 days. On Friday, February 5th, the day Matt Shea introduced his gun rights bill with the fake founding fathers quotes, the Oregon State Sheriff's Association released a statement regarding their role in Oregon as law enforcement officers. It read in part, quote, "Recently, men and women have broken the law and encouraged others to take up arms against our local and federal governments. These individuals have used firearms and their interpretation of the Constitution to justify their criminal behavior," unquote. In a podcast 5 days after the release of the statement, Krisanne Hall responded to the sheriff's press release with more of the Coalition of Western States constitutional elixir. The following clip from Hall's podcast of the 10th is hard to listen to, but it shows just how far Hall is willing to go in inciting anger, deceiving, and outright lying to further the coalition's agenda.
Hall Show. She's Liberty's lobbyist.
When the federal government can decide and interpret what your rights are and are not, and then can, through arbitrary seizures and shooting people down in the streets, enforce their interpretations by force, then there is absolutely nothing secure in America. And we no longer have a just government. When the federal government can interpret its own boundaries, isn't the judicial branch part of the federal government? Yes, it is. And so we leave the prerogative of the federal government to determine the limits of its own power through judicial opinion, which has proven throughout the decades to simply change with the whim of the people in charge. Then absolutely nothing is secure. Do you know what we learned from Lavoy Finicum? That if you oppose the government, you have to die. You know what we're learning right now from Ammon Bundy? That if you oppose the government, you will be held in cruel and unusual punishment in solitary confinement. Come on now, as a prosecutor, I saw cases where people were murdered, where babies were raped, and these people were not held in solitary confinement. This is a violation of the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments. Not to mention the 4th as well. And the Oregon Sheriff's Association says we are a nation of laws, and the executive branch cannot override the laws passed by the legislative branch, nor can we ignore the clear guidance of the judicial branch. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it guidance or is it law from the judicial branch? See, when you don't know the facts and you are confused by the truth, your own statements contradict each other. So are they interpreting it as a law or is it guidance now? We are a nation of laws, and the executive branch cannot override the laws passed by the legislative branch, nor can we ignore the clear guidance of the judicial branch. I will repeat, Sheriff, you are not a hireling of the government. You are a representative of the people who took an oath to defend their life, their property, their liberty, their rights, not support the government's laws when those laws are in violation of our rights. Let me give you this admonition, Oregon State Sheriff's Association. That mentality that you cannot override the laws passed by the legislative branch nor ignore the clear guidance of the judicial branch is immoral. I believe that we have good moral men who are our and women who are our sheriffs. But this mentality that you have no other obligation but to enforce the law is absolutely and completely immoral. And it didn't work in Nuremberg. Oh, I'm sorry, we were just following the orders of our executive branch. I will remind you that everything that Hitler did, from the rounding up of the Jews and their execution in the concentration camps, was done by a matter of law that was lawfully passed by their government. And what our sheriffs are saying is, well, we would just have to enforce that law. We would just have to round up the Jews and execute them because that's what the law says. And it didn't work in Nuremberg, so how's it going to work for you? That's immoral. Well, don't be ridiculous, Krisanne. Of course we wouldn't round up the Jews and execute them. So what you are telling me, Mr. and Mrs. Sheriff, is that there are some laws that you will not enforce? So it's not a matter of obligation for you to enforce the laws and follow the dictates of the courts. Is that what you're telling me? You wouldn't imprison Dred Scott? You wouldn't take the Hopi Indians and throw them into internment camps? You wouldn't take the Japanese Americans and throw them in internment camps? You wouldn't do that? Well, the executive and the legislative and the judicial says you have to. Now let me ask you another very important question. Is this how you want your child, your daughter, your son, your wife to be treated? Is this how you want the liberty of your children to be determined by the legislative and judicial branches, enforced with no discretion by a person who says, I'm just following the law, ma'am. I've got to throw you in jail and put you in the back of the bus. Is that how you want your family treated? Because that's exactly what you're advocating, Oregon Sheriff's Association. You are not a pawn. You are not a puppet. You are not a tool of any arm of government. You are a defender of the rights and the liberty of the people, and it's about time you start acting like it. Make that decision and say, not on my watch. I took an oath. I'll defend your liberty, ma'am. Sit wherever you want. God bless. See you tomorrow.
Despicable. Krisanne Hall has no honor. To sell her constitutional elixir, she degraded men and women across the United States who honor their oaths as county sheriffs and serve their communities to the best of their abilities. On Thursday, February 11th, Hall and Michelle Fiore were live streamed on the internet by Gavin Seam, talking to the last 4 holdouts at Malheur as they were negotiating their surrender with the FBI. Fiore also traveled to Malheur to insert herself into the dramatic situation unfolding there. The negotiations with the holdouts were successful, and the armed takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was over 41 days after it had started on January 2nd, 2016. Afterwards, the coalition members who were on location in Harney County held a staged press conference.
Introducing yourselves.
Perfect. Okay. I'm Representative Heather Scott, District 1A, North Idaho.
I'm Michelle Fiore, Assemblywoman from Las Vegas, Nevada, District 4.
I'm Representative Judy Boyle from District 9 in Idaho.
I'm Shelley Shelton, Assemblywoman in Las Vegas, Nevada.
I'm John Moore, Assemblyman from District 8 in Las Vegas, Nevada.
What brings all of you together today?
The Coalition of Western States.
There's a lot of us not here, I must say. There's a lot of us not here today. We have reps in Arizona and reps in Utah and Wyoming.
Washington.
Washington. Actually, our director, Matt Shea, who's been on the phone with us through this whole thing, and one of our reps, Kelly Townsend, in Arizona. I mean, we have a huge participation with legislators, sitting elected officials, which are part of the Coalition of Western States.
And what is your mission statement?
We're a coalition of legislators and elected officials, and actually some pastors and clergy that are against federal overreach and tyranny.
And that brings you to Eastern Oregon.
Cool. And so it starts our chapter 2. So now we've got to run off. We've got to go to Portland because we've got to get together with all these attorneys. And now, like we said from the beginning, Cal is just, we took it from the Refuge to a new battleground.
Did everything go as you expected or hoped?
Everything went just as I planned.
Well, that's good news.
Yes.
Michelle Fiore seems to be pretty happy that she and the rest of the Coalition of Western States had brought 41 days of unnecessary anger and conflict to the people of Harney County, Oregon. In the summer of 2016, the Coalition helped disrupt the well-being of another American community by spreading lies and innuendo concerning an alleged sexual assault on a 5-year-old girl on June 2nd in Twin Falls, Idaho. As all of those involved in the incident were children, the records were sealed to protect them. However, knowing that their claims could not be checked for facts, anti-immigration groups started spreading false stories that the girl had been raped by 3 Syrian refugees. Quoting a story in the Idaho Statesman of June 20th, 2016, quote, "Authorities are denying reports that Syrians gang raped a child at knife point in a Twin Falls apartment complex earlier this month, saying the false claims are being spread to incite anti-refugee sentiments. Quote, unquote, there were no Syrians involved. There was no knife involved. There was no gang rape," Twin Falls County Prosecutor Grant Lobes said Monday morning, unquote. The article also stated, quote, "There's a small group of people in Twin Falls County whose life goal is to eliminate refugees, and thus far they have not been constrained by the truth," Loeb said. "They have not been constrained by the truth in the past, and I don't expect them to be constrained by the truth in the future," unquote. The authorities released the ages of the boys involved as being 7, 10, and 14. These facts, however, did not stop the Coalition of Western States from using children for propaganda in their deceit-filled elixir. About a week later, Michelle Fiore and Matt Shea posted to social media that the coalition had investigated the, quote, "child rape," unquote, confirming that the Coalition of Western States has no bounds to their deceit. In November of 2016, the Coalition of Western States stated in a Facebook post, quote, "5-year-old girl in Idaho continues to suffer," unquote, in their share to their followers of a story that said the girl was, quote, "orally, anally, and vaginally raped and urinated upon," unquote. Just as the actions by the militants at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was an assault on the people of Harney County, the exploitation of the children in Twin Falls by the Coalition of Western States is an assault on the citizens of Twin Falls. The sheriff of Twin Falls County is Sheriff Tom Carter, one of Richard Mack's so-called constitutional sheriffs. The conflict that the coalition of Western states brings to communities is unwanted by those same communities.